bulk of the advanced world aging out to the point that they all have shrinking populations, and most of the rest will flip in the next 10 years. And even the advanced industrializing countries, your Mexicos, your Indias, your Brazils, are very, very rapidly moving into that position. They will be there 10 to 20 years from now. So all four of those economic models, the very basis of them doesn't work with where we're about to be, and we're going to have to come up with something new. Very little experimentation has gone up to this point. You're probably familiar with modern monetary theory, MMT.
Aggressively.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting for a second that that is going to work, but it's one of the few examples out there of people experimenting with something new. And so as long as the experimentations don't happen where I have a bank account, I'm all for it. Because, even if it fails utterly, and I think it will fail utterly, we're probably going to learn a few things from that will be useful down the road. The only other model that I'm seeing any experimentation with, it really doesn't have a name yet, is what the Trump administration is doing, which is an artificial restriction on production by government policies that are chaotic.
You're saying the case.
Late night. I have a feeling this might happen.
Car will be here in 5.
Eso will be a fan.
Restricts production.
Absolutely. We've seen industrial production and employment drop for the last 11 months. That's not bad.
You're going to put that in the zone of economic model?
I don't want to overplay it because I doubt this is being done on purpose. But we've seen manufacturing contract, we're seeing agriculture contract, and because of tariffs, we're seeing consumption contract. On the other side, Trump very, very clearly has his favorites. And he's artificially restricting the demand of groups that he doesn't like. So a demand management model where you have an arbiter in the government who decides who can consume what. It's a combination of capitalism and fascism. I'm not saying it's going to work. I'm saying it's the only other experimentation I've seen out there so far.
Wow. Okay, looking at that as an economic model is utterly fascinating, Peter. I've never heard anybody else say that, and I've certainly never thought of it myself.
It's horrific, let's be clear, but it's an experimentation.
Yeah, but look, you gave me the chills. Looking at it as an unintentional, a natural test of a new economic model, one that neither of us, it sounds like, would support or want, but the fact that it's happening means that we can look at it through a new lens. Okay, so...
And it matches what's happening with demographics, which I find even more problematic.
Okay, very interesting. To understand this, I think the best question I could ask is, the moment we're living in right now, what is the closest historical correlate?
Black Plague. That was the only other time in history where the population declined.
Okay. What
it's not a great comparison, I agree.
Not a great comparison because it's horrible, or not a great comparison because it's not accurate?
Well, you're talking about not just a pre-industrial society, you're talking about a pre-deepwater navigation society. So it really was a very, very, very different economic structure by every way that you can imagine it. But it's the only example where not just the population was declining, but the bulk of the population decline happened in relatively young people. And so it roughly, very roughly, mirrors where we are now, where we're running out of people under age 50.
Okay, so knowing that we can't just map it one for one, what can we learn from that might give us some directional information?
Well, again, I'm not sure this is a plus or a minus, but after the Black Plague swept through Europe and killed a third to half of the population, what we saw was a change in labor mechanics, because all of a sudden there were not enough people to maintain the feudal systems that had been the European norm throughout the Dark Ages going back to Rome. What that meant is, for the first time in human history, skilled labor had an economic incentive to expand. It used to be you had lots of masses of unskilled labor who lived on the farm and paid the rents, who were controlled by the feudal lords. And then you had a thin sliver of skilled labor in the cities. All of a sudden, that group off in the countryside collapsed. And there was a need to increase productivity in every possible way. So for the first time, we saw institutions form with the specific intent of expanding the skilled labor pool. And even in places where that didn't happen, like say Northern Germany, you had a situation, it wasn't Germany at the time, Holy Roman Empire, you had a situation where just naturally the demand for goods and services required people being more productive than they had been before. So you had this alignment of institutions and economic and demographic factors that all encouraged everybody to be better at what they were doing. And the direct outcome of that was the Renaissance.
Interesting. Okay, so it does feel like there's a slightly similar setup to what's happening right now, where we have demographic collapse in China, which is the most skilled manufacturer in the world.
I wouldn't say skilled, but certainly the largest by output.
Interesting. So who's the most skilled?
In terms of the value added, you're going to have a constellation: Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, the United States, Germany, United Kingdom.
Okay, so is there any protective mechanism from that being spread out?
It's a skill issue. We, in the modern system, in the globalized systems, we all specialize because we can. And if we go back to a world where we're all generalists, you're going to have a significant drop in the technological capabilities of the planet and of the individual economies. So we all do different things. The Germans do fourth generation precision manufacturing, but have managed to do it at scale. The United States designs the systems and then marries it to close support merging with technology, which with more traditional tech, like you would think of when you think of Silicon Valley, so that everything has a services component as well. The Singaporeans, they're great at precision measurement, and then those tools are used in other systems. The Koreans, it's memory chips. We all go like Taiwan, TSMC, GPUs, all that, and that's true. But the Koreans are actually better. It's just a different kind of chip they focus on. So we're all very good at very specific things, and we take components from one of these systems and merge it with manufacturing to the others to make the products that we use. That doesn't mean that China is irrelevant. It just means that China is much further down in terms of value added. They're very good at assembly, and they have scale to do a lot of things that other countries just can't pretend to do, but they don't actually add a lot of value to what they're doing.
Right, you just put a finger on a very interesting problem. So we're in a world that for the last 80-ish years has been hyper-globalized, everybody specialized. We were all getting along because of the world order that the US put in place from a trade and security perspective. That's all now beginning to fall apart for the reasons that you were saying before. It stopped being advantageous to the US because other people felt like they were not getting their opportunity to shine economically. They didn't want to fight the most recent war that the US was asking them to fight. It was always meant to be about Russia. So we get these natural tensions. Now this hits a boiling point, partly because you have a unique figure in Trump, and partly because this is just where we were going to end up regardless. But now you have a world that's pulling away from each other, that's designed to have really easy transportation of highly specialized skills and the outputs from those skills. So as that breaks apart, what does the world start to look like? Because if everybody then has to become a generalist again, at a moment where the population is declining, how does that play out economically?
Well, this is why Trump matters. It's because he's the guy in charge of making the decisions. And as this happens, if you dial back to George W. Bush, he was the last American president to negotiate and implement a meaningful trade deal. And at the end of his terms, we had NAFTA, we had free trade deals with Colombia and Chile, Japan, Korea, and reasonably good manufacturing integration with the European Union. We haven't changed since then. Now, in my opinion, that cluster is exactly what we would have needed to generate mini globalization or globalization 2.0, whatever you want to call it. The US was very well positioned to use that cluster of countries, maybe with a couple of others, in order to make a smaller version of the global structure where we wouldn't have to sacrifice the technological level we've become used to or the standard of living we've become used to. But Obama basically sat in the White House for 8 years and did nothing. Trump has been a very disruptive force, and Biden was Biden. So we're now in a situation where all of those relationships are degrading. And if we can't re-solidify the NAFTA accords next year when they're up, or this year when they're up for renegotiation, we're going to be in a situation where a lot of these pieces suddenly won't work anymore. From the American point of view, that means doing things more or less by ourselves. And that means for steps of the supply chain that are not things that we excel at, like say assembly. We have to take someone who earns $75,000 a year, the average American income, and all of a sudden have them doing die cast and basic assembly, jobs that you probably should be paid more than $6,000 or $7,000 a year for. Wow. That manifests, among other things, as a vastly lower standard of living or massively inflationary. Those are basically our choices here. For the rest of the world, without the United States providing the freedom of the seas and the rule of law that allows intermediate products to shift around, no one can specialize anymore. And so you have a catastrophic reduction in what countries can do individually. Maybe they can cut deals regionally, like say Southeast Asia, very bullish on Southeast Asia. But it means that they lose the strength of the whole. You no longer can export to a larger market to earn income to then update your industrial basis. And that's the entirety of the Japanese, the Korean, and the Chinese models to this point. For the European Union, they've aged out. They have to export. And if they can't, you're looking at them having to invent that new economic model in like 5 to 10 years instead of the, say, 30 to 50 years that the United States has. So we're looking at, we're at the dawn of it, at best, technological stagnation as we have to generalize versus specialize. And that's before you consider some of the financial outcomes that come from a rapidly aging demographic on a global basis.
Okay, we'll get to that in a second, but I really want to push on this idea of we have maybe a narrow but closing window to have some sort of regional globalization, where we find sort of that the least number of unique countries and specialty skills that you need to continue the current way of life that we have will round it to NAFTA. And Trump is not showing the ability to bring them together, and so is an accelerant on the dissolution of that union. What should Trump be doing? Like, if you could advise him and he would listen to you, what would you encourage him to do? Yeah, very much hypothetical.
Yeah, let's start by saying that when Trump was out of power, he gutted the Republican Party of all its policy experts, so that it is just a vehicle for his personality. So the Republican Party today, it's lost its national security arm, its business arm, its fiscal conservative arm, its law order arm, they're all gone. It's just him. So when he came in with the smallest team of any American president in history. And the first thing he did was get the federal government to the top 6,000 positions, so the policy cannot be implemented. So my advice to Trump would be to shoot Vance and leave, and let's try this over with someone else, because clearly he has designed the system so it cannot function on purpose. If I was talking to any other generic president, you need to look at what we can do. Mexico is too skilled to do assembly, so we need a relatively large-ish population somewhere that is further down the value-added scale that can fill that gap. The two best options are Colombia and Cuba. Colombia, we already have a free trade agreement with. There is an infrastructure problem. Cuba, however you want to get Cuba on board, there are a wide variety of options. Go to town. It can be more than a tropical Vegas, because you've got a workforce that is probably about 1/3 as skilled as the Americans, but work for 1/10 the cost. That's a great set of math to start from an assembly point of view. Those two get combined probably would be enough for what we need. The other big problem is processing. One of the effects of globalization is we go broadly with the most reliable, lowest cost producer. And so China has lower environmental regulations, and processing is technology that was developed more than a century ago. So turning aluminum to bauxite, refining rare earth metals, getting the cobalt out of Congo with slave labor, and turning the cobalt metal into components. That North America does not do well. Now, because of the shale revolution, the US has the cheapest energy and electricity on the planet, but you still have to build out the basic infrastructure, and we really haven't started that yet. The Trump administration talks a good game there, but there's been no money really put behind building the actual infrastructure, because the people who knew how to do that were all fired in the first week. So we have to build out some more government capacity in order to lead this effort, and this administration just hasn't been interested in that.
Okay, very interesting take on the Trump administration. So if we were actually going to get the things moving, because to your point, Trump is talking about, hey, trillions of dollars of investment, people want to be here, America's the hottest country ever. He loves saying that.